conversation, I would just like to introduce Yatharth to all of you. A few lines about Yatharth. Yatharth is an attempt to bring before you the content from international relations. We provide updates, analysis, and commentaries on various events of national and international importance that help us to understand the contemporary world politics. I would also request you all to please follow our pages on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, for the updates, and also subscribe our YouTube channel for all the recordings of these experts speak. So today's topic is India's dilemma of balancing two-front war. When we look at the present security environment around India, we can only hope for good times. But one of the major themes which reoccurs or is a recurring theme in India's security talk is India's dilemma of balancing two-front war. We have Pakistan on the western border, known for its shenanigans, known for its misadventures at the LC. But the uneasy peace only reminds me of the time during General Zia, who was trying to woo Mrs. Gandhi to keep his eastern border a bit silent, and so that he could focus on the western and also the northern part. That is, he was busy fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. And we have this the Chinese belligerence at the LC, which has brought this topic in the limelight again. To discuss about all these aspects about India's dilemma of balancing the two-front war, we have Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan. Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan is a professor at CPOD, where he teaches international politics. Before joining JNU, Professor had served in various positions. He was a senior fellow at ORF. He was a research fellow at IDSA. And he was also the Deputy Secretary at NSCS, Government of India. So before I hand over the mic to Professor, I'll just like to state a few housekeeping points. I would request all the participants to keep their mic on mute. After Sir has delivered his lecture, we'll have Q&A sessions. We have this raise your hand option where you can raise your hand and we'll give you the chance to ask the questions, or you can either type the questions in the chat box. Sir, over to you. So you have approximately 25 to 30 minutes.
Thank you, Aditya, and thank you to the other group. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear.
Okay. Sorry, I might occasionally turn off my camera because of disturbances at home. I apologize for that.
Oh,
absolutely. So thank you again for inviting me. I look forward to your comments and questions. As you said, I'll speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we can have a discussion subsequent to that. As you mentioned, India does face a kind of two-front challenge. In the sense of, as you pointed out, we have two adversaries, one on the western flank with Pakistan, and on the northern flank with China. I mean, India is not the first country, obviously, which has had to deal with these kinds of problems, because if you go back to the First World War, the Second World War, I mean, Germany had faced these kinds of problems. And other countries, of course, have also faced these two-front challenges. So there are two aspects to this two-front challenge that India faces. One is a foreign policy security sort of challenge, which is essentially what might be characterized as a balancing challenge. So how do you balance in foreign policy terms, in terms of security policy terms, the two powerful countries on our borders. The second is more directly the possibility of a war and what sort of challenge that war represents. So these are two different things, because obviously I would argue that the first, which is a balancing challenge, to To make it slightly easier, I would characterize the first as a balancing challenge and the second as a war challenge. The balancing challenge is a continuing challenge in the sense that that is something that has stayed with us for some time and that is become more serious, but it's a continuing challenge. It will stay with us for quite a number of years. The war challenge is a more immediate or more recent challenge that is, as I will suggest that how serious that challenge is something that we will have to wait and see, because that is not entirely clear. I mean, there is a challenge there is a problem there, but whether that represents a serious challenge or not is not entirely clear. So those two are, two different kinds of challenges that we face. One is essentially about diplomacy. The other one is about the use of force. A couple of preliminary points as we before I get into the full discussion on these two challenges. One is, of course, that you can talk about these as two independent challenges. I mean, we have one on the west, one on the north. So those are two independent challenges from Pakistan and China. The other is as a more the possibility of China and Pakistan colluding in terms of dealing with India. So that is, from the perspective of both Pakistan and China, their cooperation is understandable, perfectly understandable, because both of them face a fairly capable and powerful country on their border. For Pakistan, of course, India is a much larger, much more threatening country. For China, it is a competitor, has been since the 1950s, and continues to be within the Asian continent on China's borders, with the exception of Russia, of course. India represents the most serious security challenge that they face. So it is only natural that these two countries would collude in that sense. I mean, that they would come together, because it's a perfectly understandable sort of reaction to the challenge and threat that India represents to both. So that's one part. I mean, so it should not be, this is perfectly predictable, this is perfectly understandable. There's nothing unnatural about it, despite the fact that, of course, ideologically speaking, they are fundamentally different countries. I mean, one is a religion-oriented, founded on the basis of religion. The other is the Maoist state, and so it is natural that it is somewhat, despite those differences, what we have is a challenge that, from their perspective, perfectly understandable that they would cooperate. The second preliminary point that we need to keep in mind is that these are also both relatively capable and powerful states, both in military and to some extent in political terms. There are differences, of course, between the two, but nevertheless, they are both fairly capable powers, so they can't be taken lightly in that respect. China, of course, is now about 5 times stronger than India. If you take the kind of gross material terms in terms of GDP and whatnot, even though that is not the case always. I mean, I think there is a tendency to, in a lot of the Indian literature, to assume that China was always a more powerful state. That is not the case. I mean, if you look at it, historically speaking, it was not. India was as powerful, as strong as China was in material terms until the late 80s, and it was only in the late 80s that China, of course, because of its economic reforms, began to be far ahead of India. So that today what we have is a completely different situation in that respect. In material terms, of course, India is far stronger than Pakistan, but Pakistan also has geographical advantages. It has political clout that can't be ignored, and even militarily, it's not a pushover either. If it were not India's neighbor, obviously Pakistan would be a very, very powerful state. It only seems small and weak relative to India, because in other contexts it would be a very strong state, and we kind of tend to forget that because it is next to India, which is a giant in many respects. So in that respect, for example, Pakistan is very different, represents a very different kind of power than any of our other neighbors. I mean, whether it's even Bangladesh, it's a qualitatively different uh, power than any of our other neighbors. So in that respect, both China and Pakistan are fairly strong and capable powers, even though, of course, China represents a far greater danger and threat than and challenge than Pakistan does, because it is much more capable than India. In terms of, I'll take the first part of the balancing challenge first, and then we'll come to the military part. In terms of balancing these two, until recently, our India's policy has been mostly independently done. I mean, these two powers were considered independent of each other. So there was coalition between the two, of course, but there were still independent threats in a sense, independent challenges in a sense, because they were not, their coalition did not really represent a direct threat to India, did not even represent a serious challenge to India in that respect. They were characterized as two separate threats or two separate challenges. And India being fairly capable, India's response to each of these challenges was essentially internal balancing, which is to say that India was using its own capabilities to counter each of them, Pakistan on the west and China on the north. It did not, Pakistan, of course, was far weaker, has been far weaker, despite the fact that Pakistan grew faster in the 1960s and 70s than India did. But nevertheless, the gap was so great that it didn't really catch up very much. So, clearly India had far greater capacity to manage Pakistan, and even vis-a-vis China, India's capabilities, India's power overall in material terms was fairly sufficient to be able to, for India to be able to balance internally. So that's why, even if after 62, for example, we did not align, we aligned, but we didn't. India didn't ally with militarily ally with either the United States or the Soviet Union at that point of time. We simply built. India simply built a massive army, a separate army for the North, and just because India had sufficient capacity internally to be able to do that we could balance. That because of that, we didn't need to formally ally with either the United States or Soviet Union. Of course, we did align with them in terms of getting support from them diplomatically, in terms of getting military equipment from them, especially in '62. We could depend on the help of, partly because of the Sino-Soviet rift, we could depend on help from both the United States and Soviet Union, at least until 1971, because after the U.S. China, after the U.S. opening to China, that sort of, to some extent, our capacity to source help from the United States reduced, even though the Soviet Union still remained. This capacity to independently and internally balance these two countries became more difficult after the 80s, because obviously China's growth was so fast that that balance that was there until the late 80s or until the 90s changed. At the same time, of course, India was also growing, so Indian growth to some extent outpaced Pakistan. So historically, if you look at it, Pakistan had always grown faster than India, only by marginally, a few points faster than India, but it did grow faster than India. But like I said, not enough to close the gap with India, but nevertheless it did. But what happens from the 90s onwards, after India's reforms in 1991, is that India's growth rates were faster, which meant that the gap between China, India and Pakistan was growing, while at the same time, because of its much faster growth, the gap between India and China was also growing. So in a sense, we had this kind of an unequal situation where we were getting, in some sense, materially more capable vis-a-vis Pakistan, but at the same time declining, relatively speaking, vis-a-vis China. So if you look at the situation today, I'll just talk about the military aspect first, and then we will come back to the political aspect. If you look at the military aspect today, vis-a-vis China, on the border at least, especially after what happened last year, uh, we have roughly comparable forces. The forces are roughly comparable. Um, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the exact order of battle along the front, but um, from all reports, we have both sides have roughly about 4 or 5 division worth of forces, which is somewhat difficult, makes things somewhat difficult for China if it does intend an offensive, because normally, if you go back and look at the literature on on military balances, you need roughly a 3:1 advantage for the offensive side. I mean, for the country that is taking the offensive, you need a 3:1 advantage to be assured of victory. That doesn't necessarily mean that you will necessarily win, even if you have 3:1 advantage, of course. But normally, the normal sort of rule of thumb is that you need a 3:1 advantage. And if you have roughly the comparable forces across the border on the LAC, then clearly China does not have a 3:1 offensive advantage. And now we also have to remember that the 62 experience was different. 62 also, China did not necessarily have a 3:1 advantage. It was roughly comparable force on both sides, but that the important thing to remember is that China was much more, China had just fought the Korean War. It had been fighting for for a couple of decades in civil war. So it was a much more experienced military, and the PLA was able to bypass Indian strongholds, especially in the eastern sector, and rout India's forces. And so that was it was primarily as a consequence of a strategic surprise, in the sense that India at that point did not expect a war. To go back and look at negative statements, for example, even just prior to the war, or earlier in 62, where it was consistently maintained that there will not be a war because China will be deterred by the possibility that any war would become a global war, and so on and so forth. So it was a strategic surprise in that sense, because India wasn't expecting a war, despite the fact that forces were face to face all along the front. It was also a tactical surprise to some extent, but neither of those necessarily obtained for China today. 62. Obviously, there is no strategic surprise because, or maybe there might be a strategic surprise. We don't know for sure, but clearly there is an expectation that we should be ready for, that India should be ready for any kind of outcome, and so that strategic surprise. We can't say for sure, of course, that whether it's a strategic surprise or not until it happens, but it seems to me at least that there is an expectation amongst Indian decision makers that we had to be concerned with the possibility of a war, of this escalating into a war. So I'm hopeful that there is no strategic surprise now, that we don't expect that there will not be a war, that may be exchanged. Tactically also, the situation is a lot more difficult for China because of the fact that surveillance capacities have increased, and India, of course, has very good surveillance, and of course, India also has help from the United States and others in terms of providing intelligence on Chinese movements and Chinese thinking and so on and so forth. So that helps. So the surprise part of it also is lacking now, which is very different from 62. China did have an infrastructure advantage until recently, but that infrastructure advantage is less so now. But also that infrastructure advantage is less so not just because India has built infrastructure, but also because of the fact that the forces are now on the front. I mean, it's not a question of getting the forces to the front. They are already on the front. So maybe last summer they would have had an infrastructure advantage. Even today, India's infrastructure is not as good as China's, but it has improved. And without the benefit of surprise, I think this infrastructure advantage also disappears for China. On the air, of course, India does have an advantage because of the altitude that PLA Air Force combat aircraft had to take off from. One Unknown aspect, difficult to know aspect is, of course, China's emphasis on missiles, short-range missiles, in that in any combat. I mean, China sort of talked about it, and we assume that China plans to do something with that, but we don't exactly know how that would work. I mean, so that could maybe ease the balance, but we don't know for exactly how that will work out. Most important distinction with 62 is that, of course, a PLA today has no combat experience. I mean, there is no PLA soldier today who has fired a gun in anger, as it were. Whereas in 62, PLA soldiers had several decades of experience in war, and that is something that Indian troops have today, because Indian troops, there is almost no Indian unit that has not taken part in counterinsurgency operations over the last several decades, because almost most units have been rotated through, and so there is a significant amount of combat experience. Very different kind of combat, but combat is still combat, and so they have that experience of fighting, and so of course we don't know how all of these will pan out, in the sense that you can't sort of say that just because they haven't had combat experience or they don't have tactical surprise that it will not that they will do poorly. We can't really know, but the issue is that it's a lot more balanced than it was in 62, and than it was even 2 years back on the front. On the Pakistan side, also there's a rough sort of balance, because even though India overall has a greater has an advantage in terms of military capability, on the front, it's not that great an advantage. I mean, Pakistan has sufficient forces there. On the air, India has a little bit of an advantage maybe, but that also is equalized by the fact that we don't have enough surveillance capability, we don't have enough AWACS, so on and so forth. So there are some of these disadvantages, of course, came through during the Balakot strike. So that remains to be said. The other great advantage that India has on both fronts is that Indian posture is a defensive posture, and being on the defensive posture allows for more to be accomplished with fewer forces. If India were to take the offensive, that would be much more difficult. And so we have been hearing reports of India's mounted strike force moving into Ladakh region, but offensive would be a lot more difficult. That balance of forces may not permit us to go on the offensive, but on the defensive, India does have advantages because it's easier holding territory, and especially in mountainous terrain, it's much easier to maintain a defensive line, and the difficulty will be on those who take the offensive. On the Pakistan side, again, terror remains a problem, but I think after the surgical strike and the Balakot, Pakistan can no longer assume that India will not respond, and so that to some extent complicates Pakistan's calculation. Yes, Pakistan did respond to Balakot, but that is a minor response. And the more important part there is, of course, that Pakistan has to assume that India would respond, because that earlier assumption that India will not respond to terror attacks may no longer be true. The one other important aspect, of course, is nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapons really play no role in either front, and either on the Pakistan front nor on the China front, for different reasons. But a lot of scholars, of course, assume that it matters at least on the India-Pakistan front because of the threat of escalation, because of Pakistan's nuclear doctrine, things like that. But I am skeptical that it matters even there, because I don't think Pakistan is hell-bent on using nuclear weapons, and I don't think Pakistan will use nuclear weapons unless the survival of the Pakistani state itself is threatened, which is unlikely to happen in any case. So I doubt that that nuclear weapons have any role to play. So do we therefore face a real two-front situation? I mean, difficult to say exactly. There is a possibility that, of course, that China and Pakistan might collude in a joint attack, or else that Pakistan launches an attack and that China joins in, or China launches an attack and Pakistan joins in. Those possibilities remain, but we also have to be aware of some significant obstacles that any such collusion, any such joint operation against India joint military operation against India will face. First problem they will have for China and Pakistan is that even though they have some common objectives, do they really have a common objective or common objectives that would suffice them to sort of that would be sufficiently strong enough to allow them to go to war? Yes, both of them want to cut India down a bit. I mean, Pakistan, of course, also has territorial issues vis-a-vis Kashmir. Nevertheless, both sides will have things to worry about. For one, for China, it will have to worry about the fact that a joint attack on India might drive India into a formal military alliance, which India has not done so far. So India has kind of moved in that direction, but India has not. India still, we are not a formal military ally. We are aligned, and we have become increasingly closer to the US, for example. But we are not formally allied to the United States. So that is one aspect that China will have to worry about. The other aspect that both countries will have to worry about, both Pakistan and China will have to worry about, are issues of abandonment and entrapment, which is a key problem when we look at alliances, especially in a war. Pakistan will have to worry about the possibility that China might abandon it. I mean, the history is that Pakistan has repeatedly been abandoned by its allies. From Pakistan's perspective, whether it's China in 1965 or the United States in 1971 or US in 1999 at Kargil. So it has had allies that it depended on which have repeatedly abandoned it. So they have to worry about the possibility that if they engage in a joint military operation against India, that are they confident enough that China will stay the course and will not abandon them halfway through. For China, the problem really is entrapment in terms of whether China and Pakistan can agree on the proper objectives for a military operation, whether China will get trapped into a larger war that it did not want, and so on and so forth. So these are not problems that are easily resolved. So both abandonment and entrapment, I think, are concerns that China and Pakistan will have about each other, which will sort of which may not prevent a military alliance against India, but a military alliance to go to war against India, but will complicate those calculations. Another issue that they will have to worry about is effectiveness. Will they succeed? I mean, what if one succeeds and the other does not? We have plenty of cases like that also. That it's not necessary that both of them succeed. And this where India's defensive posture becomes a problem for both, because are they capable enough to overcome that defensive posture, because defensive posture is more difficult. So can they resolve all of these issues is a problem that they will have to consider. That doesn't mean that a military solution can be ruled out, but we also have to be aware of the fact that that it will face that such a kind of a war alliance will also face some difficulties. India, of course, will face difficulties also in terms of there is such a collusion, a two-front attack. But the fact that it has a defensive posture might help. And it has a very large enough military. It basically has two separate armies to manage the two fronts, and so it is possible for India, I think, to hold the line, even if it cannot make much of an advance. So militarily, that's broadly the situation. I think that's broadly the calculations that will happen if we have to sort of think about them from their perspective, from Islamabad and Beijing's perspective, about how they sort of go about colluding together in a war alliance against India. On the other hand, the more serious problem, I would think, that political collusion, because that is definitely has been there. It has a long history. 65, China threatened India on the border, gave India ultimatums. In 1971, at the UNSC, China went ahead with all sorts of resolutions against India, which the Soviet Union ultimately had to repeatedly veto. Then more recently, of course, we have the NSG and the UNSC expansion issues, all of which are examples of close collaboration between China and Pakistan, primarily because, of course, neither of them have an interest in India becoming stronger So how does India balance these concerns? I mean, the key, of course, is China, because Pakistan is much easier to manage on its own. Doesn't have that much diplomatic clout. Um, especially in areas like multilateral organizations, or even in other parts of South Asia. But China's growing clout is a key problem, both in multilateral agencies, NSG, I was just mentioning NSG, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, or the UNSC reforms, things like that. In South Asia, obviously, they have been expanding, gaining support from various countries. Many of our neighbors obviously have concerns about India's power, and therefore that provides a fertile ground for China's intrusion to the region. And they would these smaller countries will of course look to China to help balance against India. So external balancing is therefore becoming a bigger part of India's choices because of the fact that these diplomatic political challenges are a lot more difficult to manage. So we have the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, all of those things were things that India was initially hesitant about using terms like Indo-Pacific, Quad. Go back and look at it. For a long time, the MEA would not even say Quad, but now we are very comfortable using that. India's relations with the US, Japan, Australia, all of them have improved dramatically. Even if you look back 5 years, all of these helps to primarily balance against China's political clout. It also helps to shore up India's military capability, but more importantly, it sort of helps to shore up India's political clout with the help of these countries. So whether these things will become more, whether these balancing efforts will become more closer, I mean, in the sense that whether India would get closer, whether it become closer to an alliance, a formal alliance, would partly depend on threats, or on the seriousness of the threat. So we have moved away from non-alignment to kind of a political alignment, primarily as a consequence of the greater threat. I mean, so as threats increase, so does the response. I mean, so that movement away from non-alignment and strategic autonomy, things like that, towards an alignment happened as a consequence of the recognition of a greater threat that we face. And so as that threat increases, it is quite likely that if that threat increases, that we would move further down on that scale towards a formal alliance. But of course, that depends on whether the threat increases and how serious the threat is, and of course whether others are willing to ally with India. That's also important. So ultimately, it will depend on China's power as well as its behavior. To conclude, I would say that the two-front threat really is a function of China's power. So balancing ultimately has to focus on China. Pakistan is important, but it's a far lesser threat, and one that can be handled if, of course, China were not there. So let me stop here, and I'm happy to sort of take comments.